The bitter December wind howled like a wounded animal as Jane Harrington clutched her swollen belly and stumbled through the blinding snow. Her tears froze against her cheeks, while pain tore through her body in waves that left her gasping. The abandoned stable ahead was her only hope as darkness fell across the Montana Territory of 1878, a territory as unforgiving as the circumstances that had left her alone and in labor on this merciless winter night. Jane had been traveling west by stagecoach when the driver refused to continue through the worsening blizzard. The other passengers had turned back toward the last town, but Jane, 9 months pregnant and desperate to reach her sister and Helena before giving birth, had insisted on continuing. "Just let me rest at that homestead up ahead," she'd told them, pointing to a distant light. But the light had been much farther than it appeared, and the storm much fiercer than anyone had predicted. Now, as another contraction seized her, Jane knew she'd made a terrible mistake. The homestead was nowhere in sight, and all that stood between her and certain death was a dilapidated stable that appeared abandoned. With the last of her strength, she forced the door open against the drifting snow and collapsed onto a pile of old straw. The inside of the stable offered little warmth, but at least sheltered her from the howling wind. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the disturbed air. Jane dragged herself to the cleanest corner she could find, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she whispered to no one. "Please help me." As if in response, the baby shifted inside her, and another contraction stronger than before gripped her body. Jane bit down on her sleeve to keep from screaming. She was alone. There was no one to hear her cries. With trembling hands, she removed her sodden cloak and spread it beneath her. Then, as the next contraction hit, she began to push. Hours passed in a blur of pain. The stable grew colder as night deepened, and Jane's strength ebbed with each passing moment. Just when she thought she could bear no more, her baby slipped into the world with a tiny, indignant cry. "A girl," Jane whispered in wonder, her exhausted body trembling violently now. With clumsy fingers, she cut the cord using the small knife she carried and wrapped her newborn daughter in the cleanest part of her petticoat. But the cold was relentless, and Jane knew with terrible certainty that they wouldn't survive the night. As consciousness began to slip away, the stable door creaked open. Through vision blurred with tears and exhaustion, Jane saw a tall figure silhouetted against the storm. "Hello," a deep voice called. "Is someone in here?" Jane tried to answer, but her voice failed her. The baby's cry, however, pierced the silence. The figure moved quickly toward them, and Jane caught the glint of spurs and the outline of a cowboy hat before darkness claimed her. When Jane next opened her eyes, warmth surrounded her. For a moment, she thought she must have died, but then she felt the weight of heavy blankets and heard the crackle of a fire. Panic seized her. "My baby," she gasped, trying to sit up. "Easy now," said the same deep voice she'd heard in the stable. "Your little one's right here." A man moved into her field of vision, cradling a small bundle in his arms. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes the color of a summer sky. Dark hair curled at his temples beneath a battered cowboy hat. "Who are you?" Jane whispered. "Thomas Quinn, madam. This is my ranch you've wandered onto." He carefully handed her the bundle. "Found you, and this little miracle half-frozen in my old stable." Jane pulled back the blanket to see her daughter's face, perfect and peaceful in sleep. "You saved us." Thomas Quinn knelt beside the bed. "I was riding back from checking on my herd when I saw something moving near the old stable. Thought it might be a wounded animal." His voice softened. "Never expected to find a mother and child." Fresh tears welled in Jane's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks." He stood and moved to stoke the fire. "What brings a woman in your condition out in a storm like that?" Jane briefly explained about the stagecoach and her sister and Helena. My husband died 6 months ago in an accident at the sawmill back in Missouri. My sisters, all the family I have left now. I was trying to reach her before the baby came, but she trailed off, looking down at her daughter. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to travel. Storm's likely to keep us snowed in for a few days anyway. I couldn't impose, it's no imposition, he said firmly. My foreman's wife is coming by at first light. She can help with whatever you and the little one need. As if on cue, the baby began to fuss. Jane adjusted her position to nurse her daughter, and Thomas respectfully turned away, busying himself with hanging a pot over the fire. What's her name? He asked after a moment. Jane looked down at the tiny face, pink now with warmth and life. I haven't decided yet. Thomas moved toward the door. I'll let you rest. There's broth warming by the fire if you're hungry. As he reached for the latch, Jane called out, Mr. Quinn? He turned back. Thomas, please. Thomas, she repeated softly. Thank you. For everything. He tipped his hat slightly. Get some sleep, Mrs. Harrington. You're safe now. After he left, Jane held her daughter close, staring into the dancing flames of the fire. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something other than fear and uncertainty. In this stranger's home, against all odds, she felt protected. The next morning brought sunshine that glittered blindingly against the snow. Jane awoke to find her daughter already being tended to by a short, plump woman with graying hair and rosy cheeks. Oh, you're awake, the woman exclaimed cheerfully. I'm Martha Wilson, Thomas's foreman's wife. He rode out at dawn to fetch me. She gently bounced the baby in her arms. This little angel's been fed and changed. Thomas said you had quite the ordeal. Jane sat up slowly, her body aching in ways she hadn't thought possible. He saved our lives. Martha nodded. That's Thomas for you. Heart bigger than Montana territory. She handed the baby back to Jane. He's out seeing to the livestock, but he wanted me to tell you breakfast is ready whenever you are. With Martha's help, Jane managed to dress in some clothes the woman had brought, simple but clean and warm. The baby was wrapped in a soft blanket that Martha explained had been Thomas's when he was an infant. His mother's been gone 10 years now, but he keeps a trunk of her things, Martha explained. Said you were welcome to whatever you needed. The main room of the cabin was larger than Jane had realized the night before. A sturdy table sat near the stone fireplace, and shelves lined with books covered one wall. Everything was simple, but meticulously maintained. Martha served a hearty breakfast of cornmeal mush, bacon, and coffee. Jane ate ravenously, suddenly aware of how long it had been since her last meal. Thomas said you're headed to Helena? Martha asked as she poured more coffee. Jane nodded. My sister lives there with her husband. They have a millinery shop. Well, you won't be going anywhere for a while, Martha said matter-of-factly. That storm dropped 3 feet of snow, and there's another coming in from the north. Besides, you need to heal before undertaking such a journey with a newborn. Though concerned about imposing further on Thomas's hospitality, Jane couldn't deny the truth of Martha's words. She was exhausted, sore, and in no condition to travel. The door opened then, bringing a blast of cold air and Thomas Quinn, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. He stomped the snow from his boots and hung his coat on a peg by the door. Ladies, he greeted them, removing his hat. How are our guests this morning? Doing well, Martha answered. Though I've just been explaining that they won't be leaving any time soon with this weather. Thomas nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. I was thinking the same. The pass to Helena will be blocked for at least 2 weeks. Jane's heart sank. 2 weeks? But my sister will be worried sick. I can send word with the supply wagon when it goes to town tomorrow, Thomas offered. It won't reach Helena, but they can telegraph from Bitter Creek. Thank you, Jane said, relief evident in her voice. I don't know what we would have done without your help." Thomas's eyes softened as they fell on the baby in Jane's arms. "Have you decided on a name yet?" Jane looked down at her daughter. "I think I'll call her Hope. It seems fitting." "Hope," Thomas repeated. "That's a fine name." Later that afternoon, after Martha had left with promises to return the next day, Jane sat by the fire, with Hope sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle Thomas had fashioned from a wooden crate. "It's not much," he'd apologized, "but it should do until I can make something proper." Now, as he moved about the cabin preparing the evening meal, Jane found herself studying him. Thomas Quinn was not what she had expected from a Montana rancher. His movements were deliberate but gentle, and though his hands were calloused from hard work, they handled delicate tasks with surprising grace. "How long have you been here?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Thomas glanced up from the pot he was stirring. "Came out with my father after the war. I was just a boy then. He built this place from nothing." Pride crept into his voice. "When he passed 5 years ago, I took over. We're not the biggest spread in the territory, but we do all right." "And you're here alone?" A shadow crossed his face. "My mother passed before we came west. Never had any siblings. There was a woman once." He trailed off, then shrugged. "Didn't work out. She couldn't stomach the isolation." Jane understood that all too well. Life on the frontier demanded resilience that many lacked. Her own husband had dreamed of coming west, but fate had intervened before they could make the journey together. "And you?" Thomas asked. "Martha mentioned you're a widow." Jane nodded, her throat tightening. "James was a good man. We were married 3 years when the accident happened." She stroked Hope's tiny cheek. "He never knew about the baby." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He'd be proud," he finally said. "Takes courage to make this journey alone in your condition." "Or foolishness," Jane replied with a rueful smile. "Sometimes they're not so different." Thomas set a bowl of stew on the table. Courage, foolishness, both involve taking risks when others might not. As they ate dinner, Thomas told Jane about his ranch, the 200 head of cattle he managed with just 3 hired hands, and his plans to expand come spring. Jane, in turn, shared stories of her life in Missouri and her hopes for a fresh start in Helena. "My sister says there's opportunity out here for those willing to work," she explained. "She thinks I could start a dressmaking business." "You sew?" Thomas asked. Jane nodded. "I was apprenticed to a dressmaker before I married. Made my own wedding dress and most of the clothes I traveled with." She glanced down at the borrowed dress she wore. "Before they got ruined in the snow, that is." A thoughtful expression crossed Thomas's face. "There's a trunk in the loft with some of my mother's things. Fabric and such. You're welcome to look through it if you'd like to make something for yourself or the baby." The offer touched Jane deeply. "Thank you. I'd like that." That night, as snow began to fall again outside, Jane lay in the bed Thomas had insisted she keep while he slept on a pallet near the fire. Hope slumbered beside her, tiny fingers curled into fists. In the dim light of the banked fire, Jane could make out Thomas's broad form across the room. A strange feeling of peace settled over her, one she hadn't felt since before James's death. Here, in this isolated cabin with a man she barely knew, she felt safer than she had in months. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps the trauma of her ordeal, but as Jane drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering what it might be like to stay. The days began to establish a rhythm. Each morning, Thomas would rise before dawn to tend to the livestock. By the time Jane woke, he would have coffee brewing and breakfast started. They would eat together, talking easily about the day ahead, before Thomas headed out to work the ranch. Martha came every other day, bringing supplies and staying to help Jane with the baby and household tasks. Under her guidance, Jane's strength returned quickly, and by the end of the first week, she was insisting on taking over cooking duties. "Least I can do," she told Thomas when he protested. You've given us shelter and saved our lives. Let me contribute what I can." With Martha's help, Jane explored the trunk of fabric Thomas had mentioned. Among the treasures inside, she found yards of soft flannel perfect for making baby clothes. Using a needle and thread Martha provided, Jane began fashioning tiny gowns and blankets for Hope. Thomas watched her work in the evenings, seemingly fascinated by the swift, sure movements of her needle. "My mother used to sew like that," he commented one night. "Could create something beautiful out of just about anything." Jane smiled, holding up the small gown she'd just completed. "Would you like to see?" Thomas crossed the room and carefully took the tiny garment in his large hands. "It's perfect," he said softly. His eyes met Jane's, and something unspoken passed between them. The moment was broken when Hope began to cry. Thomas handed the gown back quickly, and Jane turned her attention to her daughter. Later that night, after Hope had been fed and settled, Jane found Thomas staring into the fire, a distant expression on his face. "Is everything all right?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. He seemed to shake himself from his thoughts. "Just thinking about how quiet this place was before you and Hope arrived." A smile touched his lips. "It's nice having the sound of another person moving about. Even nicer hearing a baby's cries." Jane studied his profile, strong and steady in the firelight. "You'd make a good father, Thomas." He glanced at her, surprise evident in his eyes. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth. I've seen how gentle you are with Hope. How patient." Thomas looked back to the fire. "Always wanted children. A family." He shrugged. "Wasn't meant to be, I suppose." "You're still young," Jane pointed out. "There's time." He laughed softly. 35 isn't so young out here. And there aren't exactly women lining up to marry a rancher who lives 20 miles from the nearest town. Jane wanted to say more, but held her tongue. It wasn't her place to offer opinions on his life choices or possibilities. Still, she couldn't help but feel that Thomas Quinn deserved happiness, deserved the family he clearly longed for. As the second week of their stay began, a rhythm developed between them. Thomas would handle the morning chores while Jane prepared breakfast. After he left for the day's work, Jane would tend to Hope, clean the cabin, and work on sewing projects. In the evenings, they would share dinner and conversation before settling in with books from Thomas's extensive collection. It was a simple routine, but a comfortable one. Jane found herself looking forward to Thomas's return each evening, enjoying their discussions about books, ranching, or news from the wider world. He was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions that challenged her own in ways that stimulated rather than offended. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm raged outside, Thomas returned from the barn looking exhausted. He'd spent the day helping a cow through a difficult birth, and the strain showed in the lines around his eyes. "Sit," Jane instructed, taking his coat. "Dinner's almost ready." He sank gratefully into a chair by the fire. "Thank you." Jane served him a bowl of hearty stew and fresh bread she'd baked that afternoon. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and Jane felt a spark of something that made her cheeks warm. "How's the calf?" she asked, turning quickly to fetch her own bowl. "Strong," Thomas replied between bites. "Mother too. They'll both be fine." "That's good." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft noises from Hope in her cradle. "I received word from town today," Thomas said eventually. "The pass to Helena should be clear by the end of next week if the weather holds." Jane's heart gave an unexpected lurch. "Oh, that's good news." Thomas studied her face. "Is it?" She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Of course. My sister must be worried sick." "Of course," he echoed, returning his attention to his food. The easy atmosphere had shifted, a subtle tension replacing it. Jane busied herself with clearing the dishes, trying to sort through her conflicted feelings. She should be relieved that she and Hope would soon be able to continue their journey to reach the security her sister offered. Yet the thought of leaving Thomas and the cabin that had become a sanctuary filled her with a strange melancholy. That night, after Hope had been fed and settled, Jane found herself unable to sleep. She slipped from the bed and moved to the window, watching the snow swirl in the moonlight. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape. "Can't sleep?" Thomas's voice came softly from behind her. Jane turned to find him sitting up on his pallet, his hair tousled from sleep. "Just thinking," she admitted. He rose and came to stand beside her at the window. For a long moment, they both gazed out at the snow-covered world. "It's beautiful," Jane whispered. "Yes," Thomas agreed, but when she glanced up, she found him looking not at the landscape, but at her. Her breath caught in her throat. In his eyes, she saw a longing that mirrored her own, a desire for something neither of them had dared to voice. "Jane," he began, his voice barely audible. But before he could continue, Hope let out a cry. The moment shattered as Jane moved swiftly to tend to her daughter. When she returned to the window after settling Hope, Thomas had gone back to his pallet. The opportunity for whatever might have been said was lost. The following days passed with a new undercurrent between them. Neither mentioned the moment at the window, but Jane often caught Thomas watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. His gaze would linger, filled with questions he didn't ask. For her part, Jane found herself inventing small reasons to be near him, passing him coffee though the pot sat within his reach, brushing imaginary lint from his shoulder, letting their hands touch when exchanging items. Each contact sent a thrill through her that both exhilarated and frightened her. It had been barely over 6 months since James's death. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man? Yet Jane couldn't deny that what she felt for Thomas was real and growing stronger with each passing day. On the morning that marked 2 weeks since their arrival, Martha arrived with news that the road to town was passable. Stage should be running again by next week, she informed them as she bounced Hope on her knee. "They're clearing the pass to Helena as we speak." Jane nodded, trying to muster enthusiasm. "That's wonderful news." Martha gave her a knowing look. "Is it now?" Jane busied herself with kneading bread dough. "Of course. I've imposed on Thomas's hospitality for too long already." Martha glanced toward the door, ensuring Thomas was still outside with her husband. "You know, in all the years I've known Thomas Quinn, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Jane's hands stilled in the dough. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Martha's voice was gentle. "Life out here is hard, Jane. Especially alone. Sometimes the good Lord puts people in our path for a reason." Jane resumed kneading, though her thoughts were in turmoil. "Thomas has been kind to me. To us. But that's all." Martha snorted softly. "If you believe that, you're not as observant as I took you for." She stood, settling Hope in her cradle. "Just think about it. That's all I'm saying." After Martha left, Jane found herself unable to concentrate on her tasks. Her mind kept returning to the older woman's words and the implications behind them. Did Thomas feel something beyond kindness toward her and Hope? And if he did, what then? Jane had come west with a plan to join her sister, to build a new life in Helena. She hadn't anticipated meeting someone like Thomas, hadn't considered the possibility of a different kind of future. When Thomas returned for the midday meal, Jane was still lost in thought. He noticed her distraction immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked, washing his hands at the basin. Jane nodded. "Martha mentioned the roads are clearing." "Yes." Thomas dried his hands slowly. "Landers at the general store sent word that the stage should resume next week." Jane forced a smile. "That's good. I should write to my sister. Let her know we'll be arriving soon." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but Jane thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment, perhaps? "Of course. There's paper in the desk drawer." They ate in silence, the easy companionship of previous days replaced by an awkward tension. When Thomas rose to return to work, he paused at the door. "Jane," he began, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "I'll be back before sundown." After he left, Jane sat at the table for a long time, her food growing cold. Hope slept peacefully, unaware of her mother's turmoil. Finally, Jane moved to the desk and took out paper and pen. She began a letter to her sister, explaining her delay and promising to arrive soon. But as she wrote, a heaviness settled in her chest. What was she returning to in Helena? A sister with her own family and concerns, a city where Jane knew no one else, the uncertainty of starting a business in a place she'd never even seen. Here she had. What? A temporary shelter, a man who had shown her kindness but made no declarations. Yet as Jane looked around the cabin that had been her home these past weeks, she realized it had become more than just shelter. It had become a place where she felt safe, valued, and though she hardly dared admit it even to herself, loved. The question was whether that feeling was enough to change the course she had set for herself and her daughter. That evening, Thomas returned later than usual. Jane had already fed Hope and put her down for the night, and the stew she'd prepared sat warming by the fire. "Sorry I'm late," Thomas said as he entered, stamping snow from his boots. "One of the yearlings got herself stuck in the North Creek. Took forever to get her out." "Is she all right?" Jane asked, ladling stew into a bowl for him. Thomas nodded, accepting the food gratefully. "Cold and shaken, but she'll be fine." He glanced around the cabin. "Hope asleep. Just went down." Jane took a seat across from him. "She'll probably wake for a feeding in a few hours." Thomas ate hungrily, and Jane found herself watching the strong lines of his jaw, the way his hands dwarfed the spoon he used. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the solid reliability of him. The thought of leaving created an ache she hadn't anticipated. "I wrote to my sister today," she said, breaking the silence. "Told her we'd be arriving as soon as the stage is running." Thomas nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "That's good. I'm sure she'll be relieved to hear from you." "Yes." Jane hesitated, then added, "Thomas, I want to thank you for everything you've done for us. I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness." He set down his spoon. "There's nothing to repay, Jane. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. What you did finding us in that stable, bringing us here, caring for us all these weeks, it was extraordinary." Thomas looked uncomfortable with her praise. It was the right thing to do. It was more than that. Jane reached across the table impulsively and laid her hand on his. "You gave us shelter when we needed it most. You've been—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express what she felt without revealing too much. Thomas turned his hand beneath hers, his calloused palm now facing upward, fingers curling gently around her smaller hand. "I've been what?" he asked, his voice low. Jane's heart raced. "You've been a blessing," she whispered. "To both of us." His eyes, blue and steady, held hers. "Having you here has been a blessing too, Jane. This cabin hasn't felt like a home in a long time." Not until you and Hope arrived. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Jane knew she should withdraw her hand, maintain the careful distance they'd established. Instead, she found herself tightening her grip slightly. "What if," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "What if what?" Thomas prompted gently. Jane took a deep breath. "What if we didn't leave?" The words hung in the air between them. Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to something Jane couldn't quite read. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully. Jane withdrew her hand, suddenly uncertain. "I don't know. These past weeks have been." She shook her head. "Forget I said anything. It was foolish." "No." Thomas reached across the table, recapturing her hand. "It wasn't foolish. Not if you meant it. Hope's cry from the bedroom interrupted the moment. Jane rose quickly, grateful for the distraction and the chance to collect her scattered thoughts. By the time she returned with a now content Hope in her arms, Thomas had cleared the dinner things and was stoking the fire. He turned when she entered, his gaze soft as it fell on the baby. "May I?" he asked, holding out his arms. Jane hesitated only briefly before passing Hope to him. Thomas cradled the infant with practiced ease, one large finger tracing the curve of her cheek. "She looks like you," he said softly. "Same determined chin." Jane smiled. "My mother always said a determined chin was a sign of stubbornness. I'd call it strength." Thomas looked up, meeting Jane's eyes. "She'll need that, growing up out here." The implication of his words wasn't lost on Jane. "Thomas," she began carefully when I asked what if we didn't leave. "I've been thinking about that since the day Martha said the roads were clearing," he admitted. "Thinking about how empty this place will feel without you and Hope." Jane's heart beat faster. "We don't really know each other," she pointed out. "A few weeks during a snowstorm isn't much to build on." "No," he agreed. "But it's a start." He looked down at Hope, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "I'm not asking for promises, Jane. Just a chance." "A chance for what?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "A chance to see if what I'm feeling, what I think we're both feeling, is real. A chance to build something together." Jane sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," Thomas said simply. "Not forever, if that's not what you want. Just long enough to find out what could be." Hope stirred in his arms, and Thomas gently rocked her back to sleep with a natural ease that made Jane's heart clench. This man, who had no children of his own, treated her daughter with such tenderness it brought tears to her eyes. "My sister is expecting us," she said weakly. "Write to her again. Tell her you're safe, that you've found a place to stay for a while." Thomas's voice was gentle but urgent. "Jane, I know this is sudden. I know you came west with a plan, and I'm asking you to consider changing it. But when I found you in that stable, when I wrapped you both in my coat and brought you here..." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I told you I'd be your shelter, and I meant it. Not just from the storm, but for as long as you want it." Jane stared at him, this man who had saved her life, who had opened his home and his heart to her and her newborn daughter. In the short time she'd known him, Thomas Quinn had shown himself to be honorable, kind, and steadfast, all qualities she valued above all others. "What would it mean," she asked finally, "if we stayed?" Relief washed over Thomas's features. "It would mean whatever you want it to mean. You could have the bedroom. I'd sleep in the bunkhouse with the hands. You'd have a home for as long as you need it, no obligations." "And if feelings developed?" Jane pressed, needing to understand exactly what he was proposing. Thomas's expression softened. "Then we'd face that when it comes. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Jane. I just know that the thought of you and Hope leaving tears something inside me." Jane rose and crossed to where Thomas stood holding her daughter. Gently, she took Hope from his arms and placed her in the cradle. Then, gathering her courage, she turned back to him. "I think feelings have already developed," she admitted quietly. "At least on my part." Thomas's hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then that makes two of us." The touch of his fingers against her cheek sent warmth spreading through Jane. She leaned slightly into his hand, allowing herself to acknowledge the connection that had been building between them. "So you'll stay?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jane nodded slowly.
"For now."
"To see what might grow between us." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunshine after a storm. He didn't try to kiss her or pull her into an embrace. Instead, he simply took her hand and squeezed it gently.
"Thank you," he said,
"for giving us a chance." That night, as Jane lay in bed listening to Thomas's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time since James's death, she felt hope blossoming in her heart. The next morning, Jane wrote a long letter to her sister explaining her decision to stay at the Quinn ranch for the time being. She was careful not to make promises about the future, but expressed her belief that this was the right choice for her and Hope. "The man who saved us is a good man," she wrote. "Kind and honorable. I don't know what will develop between us, but I feel I must give this unexpected opportunity a chance." As winter gradually gave way to spring, life on the Quinn ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jane took over management of the household, freeing Thomas to focus on the increasing demands of the ranch as calving season approached. Hope thrived, growing stronger each day under the loving care of her mother and the watchful eye of Thomas, who clearly adored her. Jane and Thomas moved cautiously in their developing relationship. He continued to sleep on the pallet or in the bunkhouse, never presuming upon Jane's vulnerability or gratitude. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal, as they shared stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Hope slept, reading aloud to each other from Thomas's collection of books or simply talking. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, Thomas whittling or Jane sewing, content in each other's company. The first time Thomas kissed her came unexpectedly on a mild April day. Jane had been hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, singing softly to Hope, who lay on a blanket nearby. Thomas returned early from checking the herd, and the sight of Jane with her hair loose in the breeze and a smile on her face as she sang stopped him in his tracks. "That's a pretty song," he said, approaching slowly. Jane turned, pleasure lighting her features at the sight of him. "My mother used to sing it to me. I thought Ho might like it too." Thomas came to stand beside her, looking down at the baby who was batting at a wooden rattle he had carved for her. "She seems to approve." Jane laughed, reaching for another piece of laundry. As she stretched to hang it on the line, Thomas gently took it from her hands, his fingers lingering against hers. "Let me help," he offered. Together they hung the remaining clothes, working in companionable silence. When they finished, Jane turned to thank him and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Jane," he said softly, "I've been trying to be patient, to give you time. But every day I find myself falling deeper in love with you." Jane's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Thomas, you don't have to say anything," he continued quickly. "I just needed you to know. I love you, Jane Harrington. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you care for Hope, the way you've made this house a home again." Tears welled in Jane's eyes. "I've been afraid to admit it," she whispered. "It seemed too soon, too complicated." "And now?" Thomas asked, taking a step closer. Jane looked up into his eyes, clear and blue as a summer sky. "Now I know that love doesn't always follow the path we expect. Sometimes it finds us in a snowstorm, or a cold stable, or a cabin in the middle of nowhere." Thomas's hand came up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Jane?" In answer, Jane rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as months of restrained feelings broke free. Thomas's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while Jane's hands found their way to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for a very long time." Jane smiled. "Me too." Hope chose that moment to let out a demanding cry, and they both laughed. Thomas released Jane, but caught her hand as she moved toward the baby. "We have time," he said simply. "All the time we need." As spring bloomed across the ranch, so did the relationship between Jane and Thomas. They spent every available moment together, learning each other's habits and preferences, building a foundation for a future neither had anticipated. Thomas taught Jane to ride, leading her on gentle expeditions around the ranch property. Jane, in turn, expanded Thomas's culinary horizons with recipes she'd learned from her mother and grandmother. In May, a letter arrived from Jane's sister and Helena, expressing both concern and cautious happiness about Jane's decision to stay at the Quinn ranch. She wrote that she and her husband would visit as soon as the summer business at their shop allowed, eager to meet the man who had saved her sister and niece. "Are you nervous about them coming?" Thomas asked as they sat on the porch after dinner, Hope sleeping soundly inside. Jane considered the question. "A little. Elizabeth has always been protective of me, especially since James died." Thomas took her hand. "I'll do my best to earn her approval." "Just be yourself," Jane assured him. "That's who I've fallen in love with." The words slipped out naturally, and Jane felt no regret or uncertainty as she said them. Thomas's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. "I love you too," he murmured against her hair. "More than I thought possible." The following Sunday, Thomas suggested a picnic by the creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property. It was a beautiful spot where cottonwoods provided shade and wildflowers carpeted the banks. "Martha's offered to watch Hope for a few hours," he explained. "I thought we might enjoy some time, just the two of us." Jane hesitated, having rarely been separated from her daughter. But Hope was nearly 5 months old now, and Martha had become like a grandmother to her. "That sounds lovely," she agreed. The day dawned clear and warm, perfect for their outing. Thomas packed a basket with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. They rode out after breakfast, following the creek until they reached a particularly idyllic spot where a small pool had formed. "It's beautiful," Jane breathed, taking in the dancing water and colorful wildflowers. Thomas spread a blanket beneath a sprawling cottonwood and helped Jane dismount. They settled comfortably, eating and talking as the sun climbed higher in the sky. After they'd finished the meal, Thomas grew uncharacteristically quiet. "Is everything all right?" Jane asked, concerned by his sudden seriousness. He reached for her hand. "Everything is perfect, Jane. More perfect than I ever imagined my life could be." He took a deep breath. "Which is why I wanted to bring you here today." Jane's heart began to race as Thomas shifted to kneel before her on the blanket. "Jane Harrington," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness evident in his eyes. "When I found you and Hope that night in the stable, I had no idea you would come to mean everything to me. These past months have been the happiest of my life." From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond. "This was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to her when they decided to come west together, to build a new life." He held it out to her. "I'm asking if you'll build a life with me, Jane. If you'll be my wife and let me be a father to Hope. I promise to love and cherish you both for all my days." Tears blurred Jane's vision as she looked at the man before her, the man who had saved her life, given her shelter, and now offered her his heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they returned to the ranch that afternoon, Martha took one look at their glowing faces and the ring on Jane's finger and let out a joyful whoop that startled Hope into waking. "It's about time," she declared, hugging them both. "I was beginning to think I'd have to knock your heads together." News of their engagement spread quickly through the small ranching community. Neighbors rode for miles to offer congratulations and meet the woman who had captured Thomas Quinn's heart. Jane, who had worried about being accepted as an outsider, found herself warmly welcomed into the tight-knit community. They set the wedding date for July, giving Jane's sister time to make the journey from Helena and allowing for preparations. Jane insisted on a simple ceremony at the ranch, with only close friends and neighbors in attendance. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked. "We could go to town, have the Reverend perform the ceremony in the church." Jane shook her head. This is our home.
This is where our story began.
I want to make our vows here. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Jane threw herself into preparations. She sewed her own wedding dress from fine fabric Thomas ordered specially from Denver, a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin with lace trim. For Hope, now 6 months old and beginning to sit up on her own, she made a matching dress of soft cream muslin. Thomas, meanwhile, worked with his hands to prepare a surprise for his bride-to-be. In the evenings, after Jane had gone to bed, he would disappear to the workshop behind the barn. When Jane questioned him, he simply smiled and said all would be revealed after the wedding. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Elizabeth and her husband David arrived from Helena. Jane watched nervously as her sister sized up Thomas and the ranch that would now be Jane's home. Well, Elizabeth said after a thorough tour, it's certainly more isolated than I expected. But beautiful, David added quickly, giving his wife a pointed look. And clearly well managed. Later, when the men had gone to check on some new horses Thomas had acquired, Elizabeth cornered Jane in the kitchen. Are you sure about this, Jane? She asked bluntly. It's not too late to come to Helena with us. You hardly know this man. Jane continued kneading bread dough, considering her words carefully. I know him better than you might think, Elizabeth. I know he's kind and patient. I know he works hard and treats everyone with respect. I know he loves Hope as if she were his own. She looked up, meeting her sister's concerned gaze. Most importantly, I know he loves me not because he needs a wife or a mother for his children, but because he sees me for who I am and values what I bring to his life. Elizabeth's expression softened. And you love him too? With all my heart, Jane confirmed. It wasn't what I planned when I set out for Helena, but it's better than anything I could have imagined. Elizabeth embraced her sister. Then I'm happy for you. Truly. By the time the wedding day arrived, Elizabeth had become Thomas's staunch advocate, charmed by his obvious devotion to Jane and Hope and impressed by his intelligence and integrity. The ceremony took place on a perfect July morning beneath an arbor Thomas and his men had constructed near the creek where he had proposed. Wildflowers and ribbons decorated the simple wooden structure, and chairs borrowed from neighbors created rows for the 20 guests in attendance. Martha cared for Hope during the brief ceremony, though the baby was present, dressed in her cream muslin and watching with wide eyes as her mother and Thomas exchanged vows. I, Thomas, take you, Jane, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Thomas said, his voice strong and clear. I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life, to be faithful and true, in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, until death parts us. Jane, radiant in her ivory gown, repeated similar vows, her voice steady despite the tears of joy that glistened in her eyes. And do you, Thomas, the minister continued, promise to love and care for this child, Hope, as your own daughter, providing for her needs and guiding her with wisdom and love. Thomas's gaze shifted to Hope, who was reaching toward him from Martha's arms. I do, he said solemnly, with all my heart. After the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Jane tenderly before taking Hope from Martha and including her in their embrace. The guests erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating the new family formed that day. The wedding celebration continued into the evening, with food, music, and dancing in the yard of the ranch house. As twilight fell, Thomas took Jane's hand and led her away from the festivities. I have something to show you, he said, guiding her toward the house. Inside, he led her to a door that had always remained closed, a small room off the main living area that Thomas had used for storage. Close your eyes, he instructed. Jane complied, feeling his hands on her shoulders as he positioned her in the doorway. All right, he said. Open them. Jane gasped as she took in the transformed space. The small room had been converted into a nursery for Hope, with a beautifully crafted crib as its centerpiece. A rocking chair sat in one corner, a colorful braided rug covered the floor, and curtains made from fabric that matched Hope's bedding hung at the window. "Thomas," Jane breathed, moving into the room to run her hand over the smooth wood of the crib. "It's beautiful. Did you make all this?" He nodded, pleasure evident in his expression. "Every piece. The crib, the chair, the chest of drawers. I wanted Hope to have a proper room of her own." Jane turned to her new husband, love overflowing in her heart. "You are an extraordinary man, Thomas Quinn." He drew her into his arms. "And you, Jane Quinn, are an extraordinary woman. The day you came into my life was the luckiest day I've ever known." Later that night, after the guests had departed and Hope had been settled in her new crib, Thomas carried Jane across the threshold of their bedroom, now truly theirs, no longer just a temporary shelter, but the beginning of their life together. As they lay in each other's arms, Jane marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun in crisis, a baby born in a cold stable during a Montana blizzard, had transformed into the greatest blessing of her life. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Jane smiled up at her husband. "I'm thinking about that night in the stable. How terrified I was, how certain that Hope and I wouldn't survive." Thomas pulled her closer. "I still thank God every day that I found you." "As do I." Jane rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You said you'd be our shelter, and you have been in every way that matters. And always will be," Thomas promised. "For as long as I live." 5 years later, Jane stood on the porch of the Quinn ranch house, watching as Thomas taught their son James to ride his new pony. At 4 years old, James was the image of his father, with the same blue eyes and determined chin. Hope, now 5, sat on the corral fence, offering advice to her little brother with all the wisdom of her years. Jane cradled her newest child, 2-month-old Elizabeth, named for the aunt who visited regularly from Helena. Life on the ranch had prospered along with their family. Thomas had expanded his herd and built a larger barn. Jane had started a small business, making dresses for families in the surrounding area, her reputation for fine needlework spreading as far as Bitter Creek. As Thomas lifted James from the pony and set him on his shoulders, both of them laughing, he caught Jane's eye across the yard. The love that passed between them in that glance was as strong as ever, strengthened by the years, the challenges they'd faced together, and the family they'd built. Jane often thought back to that desperate night when she'd given birth alone in a cold stable, certain that she and her newborn daughter would perish in the Montana winter. Instead, fate had sent Thomas Quinn to wrap them in his coat and his heart, offering a shelter that had become a home and a love that had become the center of her world. That night, with all 3 children finally asleep, Jane and Thomas sat on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast Montana sky. "Happy?" Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. Jane leaned into his embrace. "Completely. You? More than I ever dreamed possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you'd continued on to Helena that day?" Jane considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I look at our children, at this life we've built together, and I know this is exactly where I was always meant to be." Thomas tightened his arm around her. "From the moment I found you in that stable, something told me you were meant to stay, that we were meant to be a family. And we are," Jane said softly. "The most perfect family I could imagine." As darkness settled fully over the ranch, Thomas and Jane Quinn returned to the warmth of their home, their love a shelter stronger than any storm, their family a testament to the unexpected blessings that can arise from life's greatest challenges. In the years that followed, the story of how they met became a favorite among their children and, later, their grandchildren, the tale of a baby born in a cold stable and the cowboy who wrapped them both in his coat and his heart, promising to be their shelter for all the days to come. A promise that Thomas Quinn kept faithfully until the end of his days, his love for Jane and their children as enduring as the Montana mountains that witnessed the beginning of their extraordinary journey together.